In this video, we'll discuss the neurodevelopmental hypothesis of schizophrenia. So the neurodevelopmental hypothesis, if you think about it and break down the word, neuro meaning brain, and developmental being sometimes during early development. And here, specifically, we're talking about most likely prenatal or early postnatal development. There's something that's gone awry. So again, suggesting that abnormalities during prenatal or neonatal development of the nervous system. So this abnormal development, whether it's again prenatally or neonatally, leads to mild abnormalities of brain anatomy. But these mild abnormalities in brain anatomy develop into major abnormalities in behavior. The idea is that perhaps we have these mild abnormalities in the brain, and then environmental influences later aggravate the symptoms. So your book goes into a lot more detail than we have time for, but so I'm going to give you some of the supporting evidence for this neurodevelopmental hypothesis. The first one is that several kinds of prenatal or neonatal difficulties are often linked to later schizophrenia. And your book goes through several. One that you might find interesting that I read about years ago is that after the flu pandemic of 1918-1919, the Spanish flu, about 20 years later, there was a peak in the number of people diagnosed with schizophrenia. One thought behind that is that women who were pregnant and put under a great deal of stress during that time, that caused some sort of, again, minor brain abnormality during development that later on led to the development of schizophrenia. When I was at USC, there was a professor who actually had an animal model of schizophrenia, and one of the things that they did was take pregnant rats and stress them out, and then they looked later on to see their behavior, which was grossly disorganized. Of course, they can't know if they're having hallucinations or delusions or anything like that. But again, this idea that a stressor, whether it's a physical stressor or a, or some sort of outside environmental stressor, that's one difficulty that is later linked to schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia do tend to have minor brain abnormalities that originate early in life. So there's evidence that when you look in the brains of individuals with schizophrenia, that they do have these minor brain abnormalities. Again, a lot of what we're finding now is in the research is that there's a disruption in the connectivity. And it's also important to realize that abnormalities in early development can impair behavior in adulthood. We're going to talk a little bit more about this third one. So let's think about this. Abnormalities of early development impairing behavior in adulthood. That comes to, what the question is, why doesn't schizophrenia develop until the 20s? What's an area of the brain that we've discussed that also continues to develop into adulthood, reaching full development somewhere in the mid-20s? A prefrontal cortex. And so many individuals that go on to develop schizophrenia show deficits in attention, memory, and impulse control at an earlier age. So even though maybe it seems as if they're developing normally, some of these other things are reported. Sometimes it's hard in retrospect to know what was considered normal behavior versus perhaps abnormal behavior. And then if you think about these things, deficits in attention, memory, and impulse control, what area of the brain's involved with these? That prefrontal cortex. So that prefrontal cortex, we know, matures much more slowly and does not do a whole lot at an earlier age. Again, suggesting that perhaps it's minor abnormalities in that prefrontal cortex, the wiring of that prefrontal cortex, connections to other areas of the brain perhaps, that is the ultimate cause for the schizophrenic symptoms.